In June 1982, Rebekah Harkness died in her Manhattan apartment with almost no one left who genuinely cared whether she lived or saw another morning. She had married into one of the largest petroleum fortunes in American history. She had inherited more than $700 million in today's currency from a man whose family name was stamped across university towers, medical research buildings, and philanthropic endowments stretching from Connecticut to California. She had spent nearly all of it. Not lost it, not had it taken. Spent it, deliberately, flamboyantly, compulsively, on a ballet company nobody wanted, on parties nobody respected, on a theatre that went dark within 3 years, on doctors who injected her with testosterone and painkillers until her body began to calcify from the inside, on sycophants who stayed precisely as long as the money held and not 1 hour longer. Her daughter Edith, who had been in and out of psychiatric institutions since the age of 15, who had tried to kill herself so many times the attempts had become a kind of grotesque calendar marking the years of her mother's neglect, succeeded in ending her own life shortly after Rebekah died. Her son Alan, who had killed a man in a brawl and been sentenced to prison, said the years behind bars were the happiest of his life because they were the years farthest from his mother. Her granddaughter Angel, born severely brain-damaged, died at the age of 10. When Rebekah's body was cremated, her ashes were placed in a $250,000 jeweled urn designed by Salvador Dalí. The urn was too small. It could not hold all of her. Her daughter Terry carried the remaining ashes home in a Gristedes grocery bag. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened. The woman who spent $700 million was carried home in a paper sack from a New York supermarket. Subscribe. Like. Say her name out loud. The whole name. Rebekah Semple West Harkness, so the full weight of what money does when it replaces every human connection can be heard clearly and not dressed up as eccentricity or glamour or a marvelous time ruining everything. She did not have a marvelous time. She had money. And money, in the absence of every single thing that makes a life bearable, is just a more expensive way to be destroyed. That is the first thing you need to understand about Rebekah Harkness. The money did not save her. The money was the instrument, not of her pleasure, though there was pleasure, garish, temporary, chemically assisted pleasure. The money was the instrument of her isolation. It funded every mechanism that separated her from reality, from accountability, from the people who might have told her the truth, from the children who needed her to be present, from the version of herself that might have been recoverable if anyone around her had possessed both the courage and the financial independence to say what needed saying. No one did. No one around Rebekah Harkness was ever financially independent of Rebekah Harkness. That was the design. That was always the design. She surrounded herself with people whose survival depended on her approval, and then she mistook their compliance for love, their presence for loyalty, their silence about her destruction for evidence that the destruction was not occurring. The sycophants stayed. The money flowed. The children suffered. The art she claimed to champion was hollowed out by her need to control it. And when the cancer came, when the body that had been injected and medicated and maintained by paid professionals finally produced something that no amount of money could manage, she was alone in the way that only people who have purchased every relationship in their lives can be alone, completely, structurally, by the architecture of their own choices. Let us go back to the beginning, not to excuse, to understand how the machinery was assembled. Rebekah Semple West was born on April 17, 1915, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father, Alan Tarwater West, was a stockbroker whose firm had connections reaching to the Walker family, the same bloodline that would eventually produce 2 American presidents. Her grandfather had founded the St. Louis Union Trust Company. There was money. There was social position. There was the specific texture of early 20th century American wealth. Houses managed by staff, summers in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, memberships at clubs whose entry requirements had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with inheritance. What there was not, by every account available, was warmth. Alan and Rebekah Cook West did not raise their children. They outsourced that function with the thoroughness of people contracting a service. The children were managed by nannies, one of whom, and sit with this detail, had previously worked in an insane asylum. The selection criteria for the person responsible for shaping a child's understanding of love and safety included experience in institutional confinement, Whether this was deliberate cruelty or simply the indifference of people who regarded child-rearing as a household task equivalent to managing the silver, the effect was identical. Rebekah grew up in a house where she was maintained but not known, fed but not held, clothed and educated and presented but never in the way that a child requires to develop a stable interior life, seen. The parents noticed her body before they noticed her. She was, by their assessment, pudgy. This was a problem requiring correction, not because of health, but because of presentation. The family's investment in her future social value required a certain physical standard. They enrolled her in dance classes and figure skating lessons. Rebekah, desperate in the way that only children of emotionally absent parents can be desperate, threw herself into both with a discipline that bordered on violence against her own body. She practiced until the weight came off. She practiced until her form was precise. She practiced until she had something to show them, some evidence of value, some return on their minimal investment of attention. Did they notice? The record suggests they did not. Or if they noticed, they did not say so in a way that registered as the thing she actually needed, which was not approval of her performance, but recognition of her existence. The silence after effort is a specific kind of wound. It teaches a child that no amount of doing will ever be sufficient, that the deficit is not in the performance but in the performer, that the self is fundamentally insufficient regardless of what it produces. Rebekah learned this lesson early and carried it forward for 67 years until it killed her. She was sent to the Rossman School and then John Burroughs School in St. Louis. She attended the Fermata School for Girls in Aiken, South Carolina, a finishing school whose function, like all finishing schools of that era, was not education but preparation. Preparation for what? For the market. For the specific transaction in which a young woman of acceptable family, acceptable appearance, and acceptable training was exchanged for the social and financial security provided by a man of established means. The curriculum was deportment, conversation, the management of rooms and dinners and situations, how to enter a room so the room notices, how to leave a conversation so the other person feels concluded rather than abandoned, how to manage a table of 24. The interior life of the student was not on the syllabus. It was in fact an impediment. A woman who thinks too clearly about the terms of the arrangement is a woman who might refuse it. Rebekah did not refuse it, but she did something the training was not designed to accommodate. She saw through it. She saw the absurdity of the formal world she was being prepared to inhabit, and instead of maintaining the performance, she mocked it. She and a group of friends at Fermata formed what they called the Bitch Pack, a name chosen with the specific intent to scandalize, and they set about disrupting the very events that were supposed to display their suitability. They laced punch bowls with mineral oil at her own sister's debutante ball. They performed stripteases on banquet tables at formal dinners. They behaved, in short, like young women who understood exactly what was expected of them and had chosen contempt over compliance. This is important. This is the seed of everything that followed. Rebekah Harkness was not stupid. She was not confused about the world she occupied. She saw it with cutting clarity and genuine wit. Multiple people who knew her described her as one of the funniest, most perceptive people in any room she entered. She had intelligence that her world was not designed to cultivate. She had creative ambition that her training actively discouraged. She composed music seriously enough to become a member of ASCAP and published more than 100 songs. She sculpted with real commitment. She studied dance with a discipline that would have been remarkable in any context. Under different circumstances, with different parenting, with a single adult in her childhood who had met her intelligence with genuine engagement rather than manicured indifference, the story might have gone differently. But no one met her. No one was paid to meet her. The nannies were paid to manage her. The schools were paid to prepare her. The parents were occupied elsewhere, performing their own lives in their own managed houses. The girl with the sharp mind and the cutting wit and the desperate need to be seen grew up seeing everything except the one thing she needed most, which was someone seeing her back. Her first marriage, to Dixon Pierce in 1939, was the logical product of the training. Pierce was a photographer, a descendant of Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, socially acceptable if not spectacularly wealthy. Rebekah later said she married him because she had nothing else to do. Listen to that sentence. Listen to what it reveals about a woman's understanding of her own options at 24. Marriage was not a choice among choices. It was the default activity when no other activity presented itself. It was not the beginning of a life. It was the absence of an alternative. The marriage lasted 7 years and produced 2 children, Alan born in 1940 and Anne Terry, called Terry, born in 1944. It was unhappy from nearly the beginning. Of course it was unhappy. She had married a man out of boredom, which is another word for desperation that has been given a more socially acceptable name. She divorced Pierce in 1946, and within a year she had identified the next candidate with the precision of someone who understood that in her world an unattached woman was a woman without defined function. William Hale Harkness was 46 years old, an attorney, and the heir to one of the most significant petroleum fortunes in American history. His grandfather, William L. Harkness, had been among the earliest and largest investors in what became Standard Oil, trailing only John D. Rockefeller himself in shareholdings. When William L. died, his estate was appraised at over $53 million, a sum that in modern currency translates to approximately $740 million. The money had moved through the generations with the patient inevitability of inherited wealth, funding Harkness Tower at Yale, Harkness Memorial State Park in Connecticut, medical research buildings across Manhattan. The Harkness name was not merely wealthy, it was institutional. It was carved into stone on buildings designed to stand for centuries. The name was architecture, permanent, visible and load-bearing in a way that human beings, with their inconvenient needs and their unpredictable interiors, could never be. Rebekah married Bill Harkness in October 1947 at his apartment at 730 Park Avenue in Manhattan. She was 31. He was 46. She brought her 2 children from the Pierce marriage. They would have 1 child together, a daughter named Edith, born in 1948. And for 7 years, Rebekah Harkness was, by the standards of the world she had been trained to inhabit, complete. She was married to immense wealth. She lived in properties in Manhattan and Watch Hill, Rhode Island. She entertained with the full resources of the Harkness fortune behind every dinner, every party, every carefully managed social occasion. She appeared in the pages of Vogue in December 1956, wearing a black chiffon mainboche dress with a white silk back-tied apron, photographed with the particular composed poise of a woman who has finally arrived at the destination her entire life was organized to reach. The caption described her as a woman of surprising range, sculptor, musician, skier, active supporter of many charities. Below her photograph on that same page was Babe Paley, one of Truman Capote's celebrated swans, one of the most photographed socialites of the century. Rebekah was on the page beside her. She was in the frame. She had arrived. Bill and Rebekah purchased Holiday House in Watch Hill in 1948. The property sat atop the highest cliff in Rhode Island, commanding 700 feet of private coastal access, a private beach, and views that stretched across the Atlantic in every direction. The house had been built in 1930 as a summer cottage, the word cottage performing the same euphemistic function it always performs when applied to houses with more rooms than most apartment buildings have units. Watch Hill itself was a specific kind of place. A coastal enclave where the same families had returned every summer for generations, where the houses had names and the names had histories, and the histories were understood by everyone who mattered without needing to be spoken aloud. The smell of Watch Hill in summer was salt air and cut grass and the faint cedar of shingle-style houses that had been standing long enough to absorb the Atlantic into their wood. The sound was waves and the particular quiet of communities where money has been present so long it no longer needs to announce itself. Into this world of inherited restraint came Rebekah Harkness with the Harkness fortune and an appetite for attention that the community read immediately and correctly as a threat. While Bill was alive, they hosted parties every weekend during the summer season that the neighbors tolerated because Bill had the family name, the social standing, the understated old money manner that permitted excess without scandal. The excess was substantial even then, but the constraints were in place. Bill Harkness functioned as a kind of social thermostat, his presence regulating the temperature of what was permissible, his name providing cover that his wife's behavior alone would not have warranted. Bill Harkness died of a heart attack in August 1954. Rebekah was 39 years old, a widow with 3 children under the age of 14 and a fortune that no longer had a second name attached to it. And this is where the story pivots. Not because her grief was theatrical, though it may have been performative in ways that were indistinguishable from genuine. The story pivots because Bill's death removed the one structural constraint on her behavior, which was not love and was not companionship, but was the presence of another person whose name was on the money and whose judgment, however passively exercised, functioned as an external limit on the performance. Bill Harkness was gone. The money was not. She inherited a fortune exceeding $700 million in modern dollars. She was alone with that money and 3 children and an unprocessed childhood of emotional abandonment and no one, not a single person in her orbit, with both the standing and the independence to tell her the truth about anything she was doing or becoming. The spending began immediately and did not stop for 28 years until there was almost nothing left to spend. Let us be specific about the spending because the specificity is the indictment. It was not investment. It was not philanthropy in any meaningful sense, though it often wore philanthropy's public-facing clothing. The spending was performance. The same performance she had been trained to execute since childhood. The management of appearances, the production of an exterior so elaborate, so expensive, so utterly impossible to ignore that the interior, the empty, unmet, unseen interior, could continue to go unexamined by anyone, including herself. She expanded Holiday House to 42 rooms, 8 kitchens, 21 bathrooms. 9 servants and 3 cooks staffed the property full-time. She hosted parties of such scale and duration that the neighbors, old money families whose ancestors had summered in Watch Hill for generations and who regarded visible excess as evidence of insufficient breeding, were scandalized beyond the capacity of polite complaint. She washed her swimming pool with Dom Perignon. She put scotch in her fish tanks and watched the fish swim through it as though this were amusing rather than wasteful, which it was both, and neither, because the point was never the champagne or the scotch. The point was the telling. The point was being the woman about whom these stories were told. She was thrown off a cruise ship for swimming nude in the passenger pool and swearing at the Filipino orchestra after throwing plates at them. She disguised herself as a cleaning woman and knocked on J.D. Salinger's door, attempting to persuade the most reclusive writer in America to let her adapt his fiction, as though genius could be purchased the way she purchased ballet dancers and interior decorators and the silence of people who depended on her money. She dyed a neighbor's cat green in retaliation after they sued her for erecting a blue geodesic dome on the Holiday House grounds. She dressed as a maid at her own dinner parties and served cocktails to guests who did not recognize her, then watched their faces when the disguise was revealed, collecting the reaction the way a performer collects applause. Every act was engineered to produce a response. Every response confirmed her existence. The attention was the currency. It was always the currency. This was the behavior of a woman who had never been adequately seen, performing increasingly outrageous acts in the escalating hope that sheer volume of spectacle might fill the space where genuine recognition should have been. And then she found ballet, and ballet almost saved her. For one brief period, the encounter between Rebekah Harkness and professional dance produced something resembling genuine purpose, almost, and then it did not. The love of dance was real. That needs to be acknowledged because what followed was not entirely cynical, not at the beginning. Rebekah had studied ballet and Spanish dance since childhood. She understood it in her body, in the way of someone who had used physical discipline as the primary language of self-worth since the age of 8, when her parents enrolled her to correct the problem of her weight. When she began funding the arts through the Rebekah Harkness Foundation in 1959, there was something genuine in the impulse, something that connected to the girl who had danced alone, trying to be noticed. She sponsored Jerome Robbins. She funded the Robert Joffrey Ballet Company with substantial grants. In 1962, she invited the entire Joffrey Company to use Holiday House as a summer workshop, providing the dancers with housing, meals, charge accounts at local shops, dental work, cosmetic surgery if they wanted it, nose jobs at the drop of a hat, medical care of a quality that most working dancers had never experienced. For a brief and genuinely beautiful period, she was exactly what the dance world needed, a patron of deep resources and authentic enthusiasm. But Rebekah Harkness could not remain a patron. A patron supports. A patron enables. A patron steps back and lets the work be the thing that is seen. Rebekah could not step back. She could not be invisible. Invisibility was the condition of her childhood, and she had spent every year since engineering against its return. She wanted her name on the company. She approached Robert Joffrey and told him to rename the ballet after her. He refused. He told her the company had a name and the name was his and would remain his regardless of her generosity. For a woman whose entire internal architecture was organized around the desperate requirement to be named, to be central, to be the acknowledged origin of everything she touched, that refusal was not a professional disagreement. It was a repetition of every room in St. Louis where she had performed and no one had noticed. It was the parents again. It was the silence again. Her retaliation was methodical and devastating, and it revealed, more clearly than any biography could, the exact mechanism by which her psychology operated when it encountered resistance. She withdrew every dollar of funding from the Joffrey overnight, without warning, without negotiation, without any of the procedural courtesies that the institutional world of arts patronage normally observed. Then she recruited 14 of his best dancers, offering contracts that Joffrey could not match because he was a choreographer running a dance company and she was a woman with $700 million who had decided that the company's best people now belonged to her. She formed the Harkness Ballet in 1964 with 40 dancers and an initial endowment of $2 million. She had not merely left the Joffrey. She had eviscerated it. She had identified the thing he loved most, his dancers, and she had purchased them out from under him with the casual efficiency of someone buying furniture. This was not business strategy. This was the emotional logic of a woman who had learned in childhood that if the world will not give you recognition voluntarily, you must acquire the means to compel it, and if someone refuses you, you must acquire what they have until the refusal becomes irrelevant. The Harkness Ballet toured internationally. It performed across Europe and the United States to reviews that ranged from respectful to dismissive. It had choreographers of real reputation, Agnes de Mille, Donald Sadler, and principal dancers like Marjorie Talchief and Helgi Thomasson. And at the center, funding everything, controlling artistic decisions she was not trained to make, inserting herself into every creative conversation as the authority whose money made authority unnecessary, was Rebekah. The New York Times observed with surgical directness that this arrangement effectively kept her from having to see her 3 children on anything like a regular basis. The paper printed this. No one around her paused. She purchased a mansion at 4 East 75th Street in Manhattan, the former home of Thomas J. Watson, founder of IBM, and converted it into Harkness House for Ballet Arts. 5 studios, a library with a music listening room, a canteen, a resident physician, a resident masseur, marble staircases, silk shades, crystal chandeliers. She bought office desks for administrators that cost months of New York rent. The building was beautiful in the way that money can make anything beautiful, which is to say impressive to look at and entirely hollow as a substitute for the thing it is pretending to be. Then the theatre. Starting in 1972, she converted a former movie house near Lincoln Center into the Harkness Theatre at a cost of $5 million, 1,250 seats, a stage with a double layer of basket-weave wooden floor on rubber springs, scientifically designed to absorb the impact of a dancer's leap. A ceiling mural by Enrique Cenis Oliver, featuring nude dancers, male genitalia rendered as candelabras, and at the center of the composition, nude and presiding, Rebekah herself. The theatre opened in April 1974. On opening night, guests stubbed cigarettes into the blue carpets and someone stole the gold-plated faucets from the bathrooms as souvenirs. The seating was too limited for profitability. The sight lines were poor. The economy was collapsing. By 1975, the annual deficit reached $1.5 million. The theatre was demolished, replaced by an apartment building, 3 years from first curtain to rubble. The Harkness Ballet dissolved in the same period. The dancers she had lured from the Joffrey scattered to other companies. The machine stopped when the money stopped, because the money had always been the machine. She married twice more after Bill. In 1961, she married Benjamin Harrison Keene, a prominent physician and professor of tropical medicine at Cornell Medical College. The marriage lasted 4 acrimonious years. They divorced in 1965, and Keene walked away with the relief of a man escaping a burning building. In 1974, she married Niels Lauerson, another doctor, this one 20 years her junior. That marriage lasted 3 exhausting years before ending in divorce in 1977. 4 marriages total, 4 failures, each one shorter and more desperate than the last, each one a repetition of the same fundamental pattern. A woman seeking in a husband's presence the recognition she had never received in childhood, discovering that no husband could provide it because the deficit was not romantic but developmental, not a gap that a partner could fill but a wound that required a kind of repair she had never been offered, and by the 1970s was almost certainly too late to attempt. Between and during these marriages she had Bobby Skeevers, a dancer, 25 years her junior, gay by his own identification, living with her in the penthouse at the Carlisle Hotel. Their arrangement was transactional with a transparency that would have been almost admirable if it were not so profoundly devastating in what it revealed about her understanding of human contact. She paid. He stayed. He provided a physical presence in the rooms of her life that she could point to as evidence of not being alone, without any of the demands that actual intimacy would have imposed, which are the demands of being truly known, including the parts that are not presentable, including the emptiness, including the need. Skeevers despised her children. When she planned a nursery for her brain-damaged granddaughter Angel above his room, he said, and this is on the record, "Let the little creature die." He was one of the last people standing in her orbit when everything else had fallen away. That he was the one who remained tells you precisely what money buys in the way of human company. Now the children, because the children are the verdict, not on her spending, not on her parties, not on the champagne pool or the green cat or the mural with her own nude body on the ceiling of a theatre that lasted 3 years. The children are the verdict on the lie that was her life, which was the lie that money could substitute for the one thing she had never received and therefore could not give, which was parental presence, real presence, the kind that shows up without a checkbook and without an audience and without a performance and simply stays in the room. Alan, her oldest, grew up surrounded by the chaos of a household organized around his mother's needs and staffed by people whose loyalty was purchased by the hour. In 1977 in Miami, he got into a fight and shot and killed a man. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. From behind those walls, Alan Pierce made a statement that should be read as the single most damning indictment of Rebekah Harkness's life ever delivered by anyone. He said the years he spent in prison were the happiest of his life. The happiest. Because prison, with its enforced structure, its rigid schedule, its concrete walls that did not pretend to be anything other than walls, was more livable than the world his mother's money had built. He did not want contact with her. He did not want to return to her orbit. The cage he chose was honest about being a cage, and that honesty was preferable to the gilded, champagne-washed, crystal chandelier-lit cage he had grown up in, which pretended to be freedom while providing none of the things that freedom actually requires, which are stability, consistency, and the sustained presence of a parent who is paying attention to you rather than to the room. Terry married and had a daughter named Angel who was born severely brain-damaged and required constant care for every one of her 10 years of life. Angel died at 10. Terry carried that grief forward through the years. And Edith Hale Harkness, born 1948, the only child Rebekah had with Bill Harkness. Edith, who carried whatever genetic vulnerability toward depression may have existed in the bloodline, amplified past the point of survival by the specific environmental catastrophe of being raised by Rebekah Harkness. Edith was suicidal by 15. She jumped from a tall building while her mother was present. She survived. She was institutionalized. She was released. She tried again. She was institutionalized again. The cycle continued for nearly 20 years, each attempt a communication in the only language left to a girl whose mother could not hear any other, each institutionalization a temporary interruption that addressed the symptom and returned Edith to the cause. She used her mother's pills. Sit with this. The medications Rebekah accumulated as part of the daily chemical maintenance of a woman who treated her own body as a project requiring constant pharmaceutical intervention were accessible, physically present, available in drawers and cabinets and medicine chests throughout whatever residence they shared, to a daughter who wanted to die. The instruments of self-destruction were provided by the same household that was supposed to provide the reasons for living. The pills were always there. The mother never was. Or was there physically, in the same building, sometimes in the same room, sometimes in the same conversation, but so thoroughly absent in every dimension that constitutes actual maternal presence, so completely occupied by the performance of her own life, by the ballet and the parties and the spending and the next project and the next husband and the next spectacular gesture, that her physical proximity was worse than absence. Because absence at least leaves room for fantasy, for the possibility that the missing parent would be different if they were here. Proximity without presence destroys even that. It proves daily, hourly, with the grinding repetitiveness of evidence that cannot be denied, that the parent is right there and is choosing, actively, continuously, not to see you. Not because they cannot, because they will not. Because something else, anything else, the champagne, the dancers, the urn, the mural, the room, is always more interesting than the daughter who is standing right there asking without words to be seen. The final years were the architecture made visible, the scaffolding exposed, the performance stripped of its set decoration until nothing remained but the mechanism itself, grinding forward without purpose or audience. By the late 1970s, the fortune was largely spent. The ballet was dissolved, its dancers dispersed to other companies that had survived on steadier funding and more stable leadership. The theatre was rubble beneath a new apartment building on Broadway. The properties were being liquidated one by one, each sale a contraction of the world she had built. Each check deposited a confirmation that the world was shrinking toward the dimensions she had always feared, the dimensions of a room with no audience, a life with no spectacle, a woman with no performance left to give. Holiday House went to the Watch Hill Association in 1973 and was parceled into lots. The 42 rooms and 21 bathrooms eventually reduced to 11,000 square feet and 10 bathrooms by owners who valued restraint, or at least valued resale. The mansion on the Hudson River at Sneeden's Landing was sold. The penthouse remained. Bobby Skeever's remained. A few others remained whose names do not survive in the record because their function was not to be remembered but to be present, to fill chairs at a table that had once seated Dalí and Warhol, and now seated whoever was willing to sit for whatever compensation Rebekah could still provide. She checked into Silver Hill, a rehabilitation facility in New Canaan, Connecticut, to address the addictions that had accumulated across decades, the alcohol that had been social and then habitual and then necessary, the pills that had been prescribed and then accumulated and then consumed in quantities that no prescription had ever authorized, the vitamin and hormone injections that had been administered by physicians whose medical judgment was subordinate to their clients' demands. She was treated. She was released. The addictions continued because the addictions had never been the disease. They were the medication for the disease, and the disease was a lifetime of emptiness that no substance and no amount of money and no number of dancers and no volume of champagne had ever successfully filled. Her body was failing in ways that the money had actively accelerated rather than prevented. The testosterone injections, administered over years by physicians whose medical ethics were entirely subordinate to their client's checkbook, had caused her muscles to calcify into something rigid and painful and grotesque. Her body had swollen with fluid retention until it had doubled in size. The frame that had once been photographed for Vogue in Mainboche, now unrecognizable, distorted, a physical manifestation of the distortion that had characterized her entire inner life. Her face had hardened into a mask. Visitors described the experience of being near her in terms that belonged to horror rather than biography. Bobby Skeever said kissing her was like kissing a dead person, a rotting person. This from the man who had stayed. This from the person who constituted her closest remaining human relationship. She was diagnosed with advanced stomach cancer. Surgery revealed the disease had spread beyond intervention. There was nothing that could be done except manage the pain. And managing pain had been the organizing principle of her entire life, though the earlier medications had been managing a different kind of pain, the kind that does not show on a scan, the kind that begins in a nursery in St. Louis where the nannies come and go and the parents do not come at all. She died on June 17, 1982 in Manhattan. She was 67 years old. The apartment where she died was not the 42-room holiday house with its 8 kitchens and its coastal views. It was not the Hudson River mansion or the Swiss chalet or the penthouse at the Carlisle where she had once held court surrounded by dancers and musicians and the famous and the willing. It was a room. It was a woman in a room, dying of cancer, attended by people whose presence had been purchased and whose grief, if grief it was the grief of employees witnessing the conclusion of their employment. The memorial service was held at Harkness House, the marble and crystal monument she had built for a ballet company that no longer existed. in a building that had once been the home of the founder of IBM before it became the headquarters of her need to be seen. 3 days after her death, her body was cremated. And then the urn. She had commissioned Salvador Dalí before her death to build a funerary vessel, $250,000. The chalice of life, Dalí called it, jeweled, bedazzled. It spun on its base so that Rebekah could always be dancing, even after death. It was the final spectacular gesture, the last purchase, the ultimate attempt to ensure that even in the grave, the world would have no choice but to look at her. The urn was too small. It could not hold all of her remains. A friend said afterward, "Just a leg is in there, or maybe half of her head and an arm." The rest of the ashes were gathered by Terry and placed in a bag from Gristade's, the supermarket, and carried home through the streets of New York. Hours later, someone found the lid of the Dalí urn had come off. A witness said, "Oh my God, she has escaped." She had not escaped. She never escaped. The cage that held Rebekah Harkness was self-funded, self-designed, self-staffed, and self-defended against every person who might have offered her the one thing she could never buy, which was the truth about herself delivered by someone who did not depend on her money for survival. Shortly after her mother's death, Edith succeeded in the project she had been attempting since adolescence. She ended her own life at 34. 2 women dead in the same year, mother and daughter. One killed by cancer that no fortune could cure, one killed by an absence that a fortune had funded and maintained and decorated and staffed for 34 years. Edith Hale Harkness is a footnote in her mother's story the way Francis Ford Seymour is a footnote in Henry Fonda's. The daughter who did not survive, mentioned in passing, subordinated to the more colourful narrative of the parent whose name is remembered. But the footnote is the story. The footnote is always the story. The person who did not survive the conditions that the famous person created is the person whose name should be said first and loudest, because they are the person who paid the price that made the famous person's story possible. The systemic lesson is not complicated. It requires no special insight to identify. What happened inside the Harkness fortune is what happens inside every fortune that is treated as a substitute for the human labor of being present, being accountable, being known. Money in the hands of a person who was never taught how to connect does not teach connection. It amplifies disconnection. It provides the resources to build an entire world, staff it, furnish it, populate it with people who will never challenge you, and then live inside that world until the walls are so thick that nothing real can penetrate, including the voice of a daughter calling from the other side asking to be let in. The mechanism operates at every scale, from the billionaire who endows a wing of a museum while her children learn to manage their despair alone, to the merely wealthy parent who funds activities and tutors and camps as a substitute for the irreducible, unfundable, unglamorous work of sitting in a room with a child and paying attention. The money provides the excuse. I gave them everything. And the giving, the relentless material giving, becomes its own kind of wall, because how do you say to a woman who has given you a ballet company and a mansion and a 21-bathroom summer house that what you actually needed was for her to sit down and ask how you were feeling and wait for the answer? You cannot say it. That is the trap. The generosity makes the complaint seem ungrateful. The abundance makes the deprivation invisible. And the child learns, as Edith learned, that the asking will never be answered, and the space between asking and silence is the space in which a person can be lost entirely. Holiday House changed hands after Rebekah's death. It was reduced from 42 rooms to something manageable, remodeled, renamed High Watch. In 2013, Taylor Swift purchased the property for $17.75 million in cash and later wrote a song describing Rebekah Harkness as having had a marvelous time ruining everything. She did not have a marvelous time. The song, beautiful as it is, performs the same erasure that Rebekah's own spectacle performed, turning the devastation into something charming, turning the wreckage into a lyric, turning a woman who destroyed her children into a character worth rooting for because she broke the rules and was unapologetic about it. But rule-breaking is only liberation when the people around you survive it. When your daughter does not survive it, when your son calls prison a relief from your presence, when your granddaughter dies at 10 in a household organized around your needs rather than hers, the rule-breaking is not rebellion. It is damage, and dressing it in a melody does not change what it was. Her son preferred prison to her company. Her granddaughter died at 10. Her daughter killed herself. The urn commissioned for $250,000 could not hold her body. The grocery bag could. We do not end with the urn. We do not end with the grocery bag. We do not end with the detail engineered to make you gasp, because gasping is the reaction Rebekah spent her whole life provoking, and gasping never saved her and never told her the truth and never once made her feel the thing she actually needed to feel, which was not watched but known. We end with Edith. Edith Hale Harkness, born 1948, dead 1982. 34 years on this earth, and for more than half of them she was trying to leave. Because the person responsible for making that life livable was too busy being spectacular to be present, too busy funding companies and hosting parties and commissioning urns and cleaning pools with champagne and performing the role of the great eccentric to sit in a room with her daughter and stay, to ask how are you and wait for the answer, to be a mother in the way that requires no marble, no Dalí, no champagne, no audience, just presence, just showing up. Just the simple catastrophic act of being in the room when your child needs you and not leaving. Rebekah Harkness spent $700 million and could not purchase that. The urn spins in the Harkness Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery, always dancing. Even in death she is performing. And Edith is buried in the same silence, in the same year, in the same small paragraph of a story that has always been told as though it belonged to someone more colourful, as though the spectacle were the point, as though $700 million were the story. The money was never the story. It was never the interesting part, though it was always the part that got told. The story is a daughter named Edith who needed her mother, and a mother who had everything in the world except the willingness to be in the room. Say her name, not Rebekah's. Say Edith's. Edith Hale Harkness. Say it loud enough that the spinning finally stops.